everyone, so I'm just going to do a deep dive into the synthesizer in Natural Selection S. And this will include the synthesizer as well as the rhythm generator and the effects system, although most time will be spent in the synth itself and the modulation system of the synth. Now, this is probably going to be the easier one to grasp of all of them, I think, as the elements of the synth are mostly quite traditional, with maybe the exception of my partial system, although I think there's probably lots of synths that do a similar, the same thing. Okay, so we'll start in the Synth tab. So there's these different tabs. There's a tab for making the family tree of presets, which I'll have another deep dive for / the walkthrough. And morphing the presets, and here on the third slide over from the left is the one for the synthesizer. In this tab is this polyphonic synthesizer with two voices. So here's an A and B, 1 and 2. And at the bottom of this tab here on the left is a modulation section. And so this is a polyphonic synth. Here at the very far right, we have the amount of voices currently in the synth, so 1 would make it monophonic, and now it's a voice polyphonic synth. Right now it just should be a sine tone. Yep. So when I switch between these two, hopefully you can see the second voice is not on. It's all grayed out. So right now we're just hearing this one source, which is a sine wave. Not very exciting, but yeah. And here, kind of in the center, is the voice type, and we have a few different options. There's basic wave shapes, resonator, string, wavetable oscillator, and a noise oscillator. So if I change them, you'll see this whole thing changes, the display. So we'll just start with basic. And a lot of this is covered in the walkthrough, but here we can do some examples and explore other things, especially with the partials. So in basic, there's a few different ways to change the sound of it. Each of the modes generally have a few parameters to change the sound of them. So we can change the waveform from sine to square, saw, and triangle. And you can kind of blend between them. And here at the bottom is the morph parameter. So you can change, this is the same parameter, turning around like this or moving this. And this exists so that you can map it and modulate it. And here you can just, it's a little more fun and intuitive. Okay, going back to more or less a sine wave. There's also an FM option here at the top. So this is the depth. And it says in percentage. I think it goes up to like 10 times the frequency, maybe, at a certain exponential slope. And so this is just the depth of the frequency modulation. And the modulator is another sine wave. And we can change the ratio. So this is a 1-to-1 ratio of the fundamental frequency. So it sounds rather, no dissonance, but we can make it more dissonant and inharmonic when we don't do whole number ratios. But if we do, okay, so we have FM. We can morph it from there, although it probably sounds better with just the sine wave at this point. Okay, but let's turn that off too, because we're going to do the partial system. So as you can see, there's already two ways to add harmonics to this basic oscillator, one with FM and one with just changing to more harmonic waveforms. But then we have this partial system, which is something that was useful to me to make this very flexible. because my whole hope for the synth was just to be very flexible and open-ended, to have a rhythm generator, to really do a lot of different things so that you could use this whole evolution system and go many places sonically and rhythmically with it. And I have the other version, Natural Selection P, which does this to external things. And there's a lot of limitations in that, which I've wrote about on the site and I'll talk about in another deep dive and mentioned about in the walkthrough. But so I wanted to make a synth that just had everything work well, where there was limitations maybe in getting parameters for other synths. Okay, so anyway, the partial system was one way to help get a lot of different kinds of sounds, especially when it came to using the resonator and all, but also with the oscillator, and that was to get different inharmonics and things for physical modeling, but also you can get really crazy sounds with it. So right now we're just at one partial, which is just one voice, and hopefully know a bit about partials and additive synthesis. And so if we do add another partial, as we add more partials, we add more partials or harmonics, and so it has more harmonics. And this is just additive synthesis. We're just adding more voices at intervals, and then each voice has a different fundamental at the interval of the partial, which you can just learn about separately from this video. But basically it's a certain, just adding the same fundamental incrementally to get the next partial. Now, this works just like an additive synth here, but down below I give you more options to get more inharmonics and do some fun stuff with, and this stuff's modulatable, so you can do some wild stuff with it if you set it up right. So tone just bounces between the higher harmonics and the lower, and in the middle is an even distribution. Spread and bias kind of scale the fundamental, the distribution of the frequency. So just to hear it, they do a lot of stuff to changing. So they just change the fundamentals of the partials. Now, if you spread it down, it'll spread them all, cluster them all closer to the original fundamental until it's just one value. So you can kind of do some unison stuff with this too. And then you can go past 100 so that they cluster way higher. Or they're spread way higher, I should say. Their steps are much higher. Now bias is more like clustering. So spread just kind of changes this kind of steps. And now this isn't getting very far from the fundamental. And so they just cluster and modulate each other. And in bias more adds like an exponential slope to kind of cluster them closer to the lower and higher frequencies. So lower bias, I guess, is a higher, and higher bias is a lower frequency. So you can make really complex inharmonics with them. And I'll just jump to Resonator. Maybe this is a good time. Yeah, I mean, before I jump, you can do with these other, using these all together, you can do some pretty crazy stuff. A lot of harmonics. And you can modulate all this stuff too. So it gets pretty crazy. So let's go to the resonator. So now that we're in these partials, you can see that they add, like, let me go back to 1. So if we go to 1, there's no partials, there's none of this. Let's just hear the resonator. It's a really basic resonator. And here you can change the decay with the bandwidth. and the exciter is here at the bottom. So longer attack, longer decay. So I'll just keep them where I had them. You can do a pink noise instead of white. A little less harsh, just depends. Okay, so you hear that. Now let's add in more partials. Yeah, so yeah, you can use this partials to really make it sound like different materials and stuff like that. Yeah, so it's pretty useful. Useful enough to spend a lot of time in talking about it. All right, and so Resonator is also pretty simple to explain after all that. And string is not much harder because it has basically the same stuff going on. So let's go back down to one partial and go to string. Let's hear that string. Very basic car plus strong. You can change the decay, damp. Exciter. Pink noise. Yeah. And I feel like the partials, they don't work nearly as well in the string as the others. But they can. Like, a little bit of them's cool. But then I think they just don't sound that great. But maybe you could dial something in and like slightly modulate and offset these things. You could probably do some cool stuff. But I haven't liked too much the partials with the string. Now with Wavetable, there is no partials. And this is for a couple of reasons. One, mainly, it's just really inefficient. Partials add more voices. Wavetable is by far way more CPU consuming than all these. It's just kind of complicated to get it working well. And the other reason is, honestly, when I had partials with it, they don't sound that much better anyway. Because Wavetable is usually kind of a complex harmonic sound anyway. So no partials for Wavetable, sorry. All right, here in Wavetable, it's a very simple Wavetable oscillator. You choose the Wavetable here. I gave you a bunch of preset ones I found for free online. And then there's a user one too. So you can use user and drop in your own wavetables. And you just drop them in. You just drop in your wavetable right here on this menu. Now you can change your, when you drop in a wavetable, or even when you don't, you can change the size of the wavetable. So wavetables have a certain amount of samples for each waveform in the table, and you switch between the different waveforms. Like that. You get this cool sound as you switch between the different waveforms. And that's what this position thing does. It switches between the waveforms. You can use Ableton's Wavetable device to really understand that well. They have a great visual for that. But if you get, I think samples, like Ableton wavetables are at 1024. Pretty certain on that one. I could be wrong though. But other wavetables you find online stuff, they might not be that. In fact, these ones I found, I don't know what they are. So they actually give you a different like sound if you switch it, because it'll start to either blend different waveforms together or all sorts of things. So you can also just change them something they're not supposed to be, and they'll just sound different. Some of them won't sound that great. Some of them will sound cool. And of course, it's nice if you get the right sound, the right size. So if you drop in a wavetable and you know the size, you set it here. Otherwise, you can play around and find the sound you like. Okay, and then you also have FM options. So again, didn't really need the partials that much too, and you added even more harmonics with FM. It's already pretty buzzy. Okay, so that's the sources. Guess we'll end with just the squares with the sources. Okay, so okay, let's back up a little bit to here. So here we can transpose the source and fine tune it. And I have this octave switch, so this is on, so actually it only jumps between octaves instead of steps. And the reason for that is mostly because of the whole evolution system, and so that you can have it be pretty flexible in the voices being octaves or just transposing slightly, detuning. And if you evolve them, maybe you don't want something to detone when it's just supposed to be octaves. So that's why that's there. And usually it's on. It's not. But yeah, maybe you want it to be in steps, so you turn it off. Anyway, I'll keep it on octaves, and you can fine tune it from the other voice. So if this is on, cool. Well, now we have both voices on too. Okay, so each source has its also independent amp envelope. Instead of it being general, they have their own one. And so you can shape each one independently. Let me turn this off. Yeah, well, hopefully you know what an ADSR is. And legato just says that if legato is on, then if a voice is re-triggered before the amp goes down, instead of it jumping to 0, it will start from where it's at and continue the envelope. Okay, and then there's the filters are here. So there's two filters, F1, F2. They have the same settings. So you can have these different filter types, low pass, high pass, band pass, notch, resonant band pass, and then there's a set of ladder filter types, low pass ones, and then at the very bottom, after all the ladder types, this peak one's like a bell, kind of. Anyway, at the bottom is a valve filter. Anyway, so basically all the other ones only have two parameters, frequency and resonance. Pretty straightforward. And yeah, the valve filter is the only one with more parameters. So you have the formant, the shift, the spread, and the slope. So the formant, and let's go to a saw. So it's really saw, more like a throat. So the formant just changes the formant, which is like, well, it's the kind of distribution between the, this one uses 3 filters to make the formant, and this kind of goes between the different shape and placement. And of them that I made for basically, yeah, it's for each vowel, and I made them based on between like a very mid-range of voices. I kind of combined a few profiles of each vowel to make this, so it's just very general. And then below the formant is the shift. So the shift just shifts the frequencies of the formant up or down. So if I'm like here, and I can shift it. And here. So you can have it, you know, shift to match a different voice or a source or input, and or, you know, just to change the sound, make it brighter. Okay, so then there's slope. Slope controls like the narrowness of the bands. Like I said, there's 3 or 4 bands, I'm not sure. And this controls how narrow each band is. So if it's lower, then they're like really teeny. And if it's bigger, then they're like big. So if it's narrower, that's more pronounced effect of the vowel filter. And yeah, it can be ringier, but more resonant, basically. And then spread is at 100%. It's the normal like distribution of the 3 filters based on the profile of the format. But spread, you can kind of squeeze them more together or spread them further out. So you can make them like a smaller distribution. And then, so it could actually, you could tune it into a different profile or just have a different kind of sound. And all this stuff's automatable and modulatable. Okay, so that's the filter. I'll just go back to a low pass. So, okay, and then the last thing about the filter is that for each of these voices, turn this one on too. You say how much volume goes to each filter. So for this, there's 2 filters. So this one's just going completely to filter A, and so is this one. So they're both going to just this first filter. And so if I change the filter, it filters both of those sounds because they're both just going to the same filter. And then, so yeah, and then if I wanted, I could instead have the second voice go to the second filter. Make this a high pass or something. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, all this stuff is quite, probably normal and familiar for polysynths, but it's a deep dive. So just really making sure you know. And then, so now is basically most everything about the synth. So, and there's a portamento here. Okay. Now at the bottom is the modulation. And the modulation system has 2 LFOs, 2 envelopes, and better to show here. It has 2 LFOs, 2 envelopes, 2 random spray values, the MIDI mappable things like MIDI pitch, MIDI velocity, aftertouch, mod wheel, and at the very bottom is MP stuff. So if you have an MP controller, you can map them, the pitch band, slide, and press, and the MP controllers, and that's new. The MP part. So this is very standard. I don't have to say much. They're just standard LFOs with LFO shapes. The very bottom one's Perlin noise, so you can get Perlin noise, so this kind of organic movement that's aperiodic, kind of random, pseudo-random, moving around. So you can use that instead of these kind of repeating sine tones. So let's do that. The LFO, let's map to... Here's where you map them. Each of these modulation sources have 2 destinations, and each destination has a menu to map it to somewhere and a number box to add a bipolar kind of depth of modulation. So you can choose a source or a destination. let's say the cutoff of the first filter, filter A. And let's add some depth. Change the rate. Let's go to Perlin noise. And let's just change the center of that. And let's modulate, let's modulate the other filter with the other LFO. So cut off B. Let's go. And let's do a saw wave. I don't know. Anyway, so quite straightforward. And the envelopes are 2. By default, you have this button to apply the velocity to control the amplitude of, so the MIDI velocity control the amplitude, if this is on. And, oh yeah, these envelopes are both open because the sources have their own volume envelopes here, so these are just for modulation. And okay, so you have these spray values. Each time you press a note, the spray value generates a new random value. And you have 2 different ones that have 2 destinations. So we can put it, say, on the panning and turn it really high for the example. And now every time I press a note, it'll pan randomly in different direction. Okay, let me lower the release and make it really staccato. Cool. So now you can get random panning like that. We could randomize the filters, both of them. Anyway, all right, so it's quite straightforward. Let's move on to the rhythm system. Oh, let me see if there's any. Yeah, so you have these destinations like the table, wavetable position. So that's like which waveform in the wavetable, string, oscillator morphing, FM. These ones that say P spread, B, bias B, and A. There's also, see, P spread A by, these are for the A and B's are for the 2 sources, 1 and 2, A and B. And the P's are actually referring to the partials. So if you remember in the partials, there's the spread and the bias. And so you can, where are we? You can modulate them here, spread and the bias. So you can make some crazy sounds with that, potentially. Okay. And yeah, down here for the filter, the cutoff, and then you have the formant and the shifting of the formant filter. Great. Okay. So now in the rhythm section, if I turn it on, it'll do an automatic note generation. Pretty silly preset. Okay. So there's a few just like kind of modules to generating these notes. Now, first of all, the idea of generating the notes, and they don't have to all be like sequences like this. They can be with the envelope and all more ambient and all sorts. And the whole idea of it was, you know, although we're just in this synth video, in this in this genetic system, I was thinking the rhythm, you know, if you also evolved the rhythms, which even the presets don't much evolve the rhythms that I have, but if you evolve the rhythms, then or like with focus on them, then also like each of the children are like kind of like, I felt like they're more like kind of like alive and they have voices or something, and that was the original idea. So they're kind of like organisms, you know, when you add them, and they have like different rhythms, so they have different voices. So not only do they sound different in the synth based on their genetics, but they also have different rhythms. They have different ways they talk. So that was kind of the idea behind the rhythm system, but you can also use it for so many things. So it's also just a rhythm generator. So here we go. Far left is just the trigger. So that's just the rate that it generates a potential note at. So if I made everything always make a note every time, then we can hear the true speed of the trigger. I can change the rate. And I can, so that's the rate, and I can lock it. So that means that it's only going to run when I run Ableton. So if I run Ableton, it won't run. So now I'll run Ableton. And you can sync it. You can add swing to it. So okay. So, but let's say we don't want it to hit every pulse. Then that's where these modules come in. These kind of like, let me turn it down. Or let me stop it. Okay, these modules kind of like gate the triggers. And then these modules here kind of give the triggers that pass through different pitches. So these ones, you have different ways of gating the trigger, and one of them is to have a Euclidean sequencer, and one's to just have random allowing through of the triggers. So the random one is kind of straightforward. If the mod is at 0 and the bias is at 0, that means it will never let through a note. So the bias is just like how much, it's just basically the chance, how much of the time, percent of the probability that it will generate a note for every trigger it receives. So if I raise bias up, it'll get more and more triggers, and at 100%, it'll always let triggers through. So it's like opening a gate. And if I do it kind of in the middle, it's like 50-50. And you can see this light here is the trigger, and this light here is the triggers that get through the gate. Although they can't keep up with the fast speed, so they stutter a little. And then, so this mod one just applies a modulator, which you can choose the shape of here. And it just basically modulates this value right here. So it just modulates it from the center. So if you turn it up a little, it modulates polarly. And if you turn it negatively, it modulates the other polarity. So you can modulate the bias and get kind of like different clusters or rhythms over a certain period of time, which you can choose here in synchronized time. So that's how this random mode works, and you can use it to like kind of like, yeah, generate different kind of rhythms and stuff. Otherwise, the Euclidean sequencer works just like a Euclidean sequencer, although I have a little thing in here I really like that a lot of Euclidean sequencers don't have. So hopefully you're familiar with Euclidean sequencer. These are like the main values here, like how many steps are in your sequence and how many pulses there are. So let's turn the rate of the trigger at like 16th notes. Now, there's 8 steps, so let's think of that as 8 pulses at 16th notes. And out of those 8 steps, 3 pulses happen. And what a Euclidean sequence does is just kind of distribute those pulses kind of like equally over the amount of steps you say. So if you do 19 steps and 4 pulses, they're kind of like evenly, but can't be quite even because 19 is not evenly divisible. So you get kind of a different rhythm sometimes, especially with less steps and like this. Anyway, so if you turn up pulses, you get more pulses out of the amount of steps. And as you change this, these try to maintain the same relationship. So if you change steps, the pulses change too, to kind of try to keep what you had before similar. And then you can change it if you want. Okay, but there's some things. Okay, also this one down here, offset, is a pretty standard Euclidean sequencer parameter where you just kind of offset the whole sequence. So you just change the starting note of the sequence, basically. Slope is what I add and I like a lot, and I did it on my rhythmorphic device first, which kind of embodies this in a kind of morphological way on the images. Anyway, so slope just is simple. It's just like an exponential slope on the whole sequence to cluster the pulses more towards the beginning or end of the sequence. So listen to what it's like now at normal. And if I lower, so they kind of cluster at a certain spot. And if I do the other way, it's the opposite. Which it kind of sounds similar now because we have no kind of reference with a beat or something, but with one you'd notice it's at different parts of the beat that it clusters notes. And then you can reverse that or do a boomerang with the sequence with this toggles here. Then you have the pitch kind of modules here, so you can have a pitch sequencer, step sequencer here like this. So they're more or less all the same pitch. You can change it. Pretty straightforward. You can change the number of steps. So each time a gate comes through, a note is created. So each time the Euclidean sequencer or random gate lets a note through, a MIDI note is created and the synth plays it. And when it comes to this pitch step sequencer, each time a note plays, it just goes to the next step. So if less notes come through, then less steps are made in terms of time. And then the other mode is the random pitch. So in this mode, each time a note is generated, it just creates a random pitch. And you just choose the range of that random pitch. So if the low note is a C3 and high note C4, so it's just between one octave. And then, or you could do C5 and do 2 octaves. And slope is an exponential slope to kind of cluster the notes more high and low, like I've been doing. So you can cluster them one, which is lower, or this way, which is higher. And you can kind of blend. Now, both of these modes, sequencer and random, can go through this scale quantizer. So you can make them a major scale if you want, and choose the tonic. let me let more notes through. And then you can choose from these other scales if you want. It's pretty rigid. Sorry, it's not a super inclusive scale system. So then we have this. Let me slow this down. Last two, which are the velocity and duration of the note. So you can lower, so you can choose the lower or high. This is the range. Each of them work the same. Sorry, it's kind of similar to this random mode here, where you choose a low and high, and then you can exponentially slope the cluster more low or more high. So you can make the velocity more low by lowering both the range. The volume gets low, or you can make it higher. And you can slope more towards lower notes or higher notes. And same with duration. You can have, let's do the opposite. Let's have mostly at the low end high, long notes, and at the high end anyway, can mess around with it. Okay, so that's the rhythm generator. And then there's an effect system. And again, I wanted just this whole synth to be able to just transform so much sound, so many possibilities in the genetics. So it could kind of like, you could go a lot of places with it. And so effect system just works really well too. So this will be really straightforward. You just got distortion or overdrive. And like the gain here. And then a low pass filter just for this. To roll off the high end. And then a mix. All right. And then a chorus. Let me just feedback. Let me just do not detuned synth. And maybe not random panning. Okay. Okay, no chorus. With chorus. And yeah, just basic chorus things. Rate and feedback and depth. And mix. And a phaser. Center frequency. Resonance. Modulation depth. And rate. And feedback. And mix. And delay. Very straightforward. And reverb. Decay, dampening, and the silence. Okay, well, and the one other thing to say about these parameters related for the synth are these ones at the top, which I'll probably talk about in multiple videos. And so preserve rhythm. Okay, so when you're in the tree and you're switching between different presets, maybe you don't want the rhythm that you made to be changing between different genetics. Maybe you want to always have the same rhythm. So in that case, you'd click preserve rhythm. And now if I click these different trees, they don't change that rhythm I had, but it changed this other sounds. And same goes with effects. So if I had some effects I liked, I don't know what this sounds like. Okay. And I don't want them to change. I'll say preserve effects. So I should click this, and then if I change these, they don't change the effects. Yeah. Now preserve tree, I'll leave that to the family tree video. That deals with if you hot swapped these presets and you don't want to lose this tree you're working on, you preserve the tree. Okay, so that goes, that's it for our video. I know, yeah, I mean, maybe this was helpful if you're new to polysynths or don't know much about the effects or rhythms or just want some clarity in something, especially the partial system. But thanks for watching, and yeah, I'll have another one on more complex topics like the tree system soon, very soon. Thanks.